Chapter 1. December 1880. Millie finished washing the last dish and removed her apron. She stretched to remove the kinks from her sore body. "Are you sure you're up to driving to town today, Mama?" Patience looked at her skeptically. "With the way you've been feeling, maybe I should just walk into town to meet the stagecoach. Or Papa could go." The 7-year-old's voice was anxious as she spoke to her stepmother. She was truly worried about her. Millie smiled at her daughter. "It would take you hours each way." "I'll be fine, Patience. This pregnancy is just taking a little more out of me than I expected it to." She rubbed the small of her back, wishing the persistent back pain would go away. Patience took Grace's hand and led her toward the sleigh. "I'm glad your friend Charlotte is coming to help until after she's born." They had no way of knowing if the baby Millie carried was a boy or girl, but the whole family had taken to calling it she. They hadn't even picked out a boy's name. "I am too. I hope she and James get along okay." Millie had asked her friend, Charlotte, who had been raised in the same Boston orphanage she had, to come and stay with her for a while until the baby was born. The hope was that Charlotte would fall in love with her friend Bess's brother-in-law, James, and the two would marry. Charlotte had aged out of the orphanage and had nowhere to go. She could have chosen from a list of men to marry, as Millie had, and become a mail-order bride, but had instead decided to try life where Millie was. At least she would have a friend there, and wouldn't feel as if she was starting over completely. James had paid for her fare, with the understanding he would be allowed to court Charlotte when she arrived. Millie hefted 3-year-old Grace into the sleigh and climbed up after her. Both Jacob and Michael were in the barn, helping George repair the plow. Mostly they were getting in his way, but George enjoyed having the boys with him, especially in the winter months. It was mid-December, and with Christmas right around the corner, there were a lot of secrets in their small house. George had hitched the sleigh up for her when he'd come home for lunch. Millie had a few things to buy in town, and then she needed to meet the stagecoach at 2. She was so excited to see her friend. She'd changed a lot in the 8 months since she'd left Boston, and wondered if her friend would be the same young woman she remembered. They'd had a good crop that fall, and Millie was happy having her friend stay with them wouldn't be a financial burden on George. The extra food shouldn't cause too many problems, and George had promised to do some hunting for extra meat if they needed it. Millie took both girls into the store while she made her purchases. It was much too cold in the winter in Minnesota to stay outside for any period of time. She quickly purchased the dry goods she needed, and a small amount of cotton to make a gown for the baby. She had some scraps she'd started to make a baby quilt from as well. She was hoping Charlotte would help her when she got there. She was putting the cotton fabric she'd chosen on the counter when she felt a hand on her back. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Stevens?" Millie turned to see who it was. She almost winced. It was Agnes, the biggest busybody in the entire town. Agnes had done some nice things for her family before she'd come, and if it hadn't been for Agnes, she never would have married George. Still, it was hard to stomach the woman. "I'm tired, but doing all right." "You?" Agnes looked Millie up and down. "You sure do get bigger every day. You need to cut back on what you're eating. You're going to be as big as a house when that baby comes." Her tone of voice was as if she was doing her best to be helpful, but it still made Millie want to scream. Millie sighed. She knew she was much bigger than she should be at only 7.5 months, but she hadn't increased her food intake by very much. Her stomach seemed to stand out in front of her by a mile, though. She wished she could hide her belly from Agnes if from no one else. "I just hope the baby is healthy." Millie did her best to keep her tone mild as she responded. Patience eyed the candy in the jars lining the counter. Millie wished they could afford to buy the girls some, but with Christmas coming, she promised herself each of the children would get at least one piece for their stocking. Millie paid for her purchases and nodded to Agnes on the way out of the store. "Mama, why was Mrs. Sims telling you to cut back on what you eat? Why does she think she knows what you eat?" Millie sighed. "Some people think they have the right to tell everyone else what's best for them." She paused as she tried to come up with the best way to explain things to her daughter. "Since this is the first time I've had a baby, and Mrs. Sims had several, She thinks it's okay to give me advice about having babies. Because my belly is bigger than she thinks it should be, she thinks I eat too much. Patience made a face. She doesn't know anything about how much you eat. That's not right. Patience would defend her mama to the end. Millie smiled, squeezing Patience's hand, and then picked up the reins. Remember this when you get older, Patience. Some people just don't know when to stop talking. It makes me mad when people say mean things to you. I know it does, and I thank you for it. It doesn't bother me, though, because I know it's not true. Millie said the words to convince herself as much as she tried to convince her daughter. She was a little worried about how big she was getting, but there wasn't much she could do about it. She parked the sleigh across from the stagecoach stop, and climbed down carefully to see if the stagecoach was expected on time. The girls waited in the sleigh, covered by the blankets and thick quilts Millie had put over them when they left home. Just as she was stepping up to the window for the telegraph and stagecoach office, she saw the stagecoach come rumbling to a stop. Millie turned and watched as the people disembarked, excited to see her friend. When she finally saw Charlotte's dark curls, she hurried forward to embrace her friend. "You're here. You're really here." Charlotte pulled away and looked down at Millie. Charlotte was a tall woman, where Millie was short. "It's so good to see you. How are you feeling?" Charlotte was blonde, while Millie had dark hair. Charlotte had always been curvier than Millie, but now Millie was pregnant, her shape had changed a great deal. It was the first question everyone asked her these days. "Round," Millie answered shortly. "I'm feeling very round." She sighed and patted her belly through her thick coat. Charlotte let out a quick laugh. "You're looking rather round." She turned and looked around. "Didn't you bring the children?" "Just the girls. They're in the sleigh. Let's get your things, and we'll drive home." She gave her friend another one-armed hug. "I'm so glad you're here. I hope you don't mind sleeping in with the girls." Charlotte shook her head. "Having only 2 girls to share a room with will feel like privacy after the crowded girls' room in the orphanage." Millie nodded, remembering her days there. "Patience is really excited about you sleeping with them. You'll like my Patience. She's a good girl and wants to help with everything." The pride in Millie's voice was apparent as she talked about Patience. "When will I meet James?" Charlotte blurted out. She was conflicted about meeting the young man whom she may marry. She was nervous about seeing him, but also excited to meet him. Millie grinned as she looked at her friend. "He'll be at church on Sunday. I think you'll like him." "I hope so. I'd hate it if he paid my fare out here and then we didn't get along." That had been her fear since they'd first started planning her visit. What if he paid all that money for her to travel out there, and she didn't like him? What if he didn't like her? Millie shook her head. It was a risk he was willing to take. He didn't want to be locked into a loveless marriage either. "If either of you don't get along, then you can move on." Millie had prayed that wouldn't be the case. She didn't want to have to say goodbye to her friend again. Charlotte grabbed her 2 bags and carried them to the sleigh behind Millie. "I was able to get a job helping out a widow in town for a couple of months, so I have a little money saved." She paused. "If I have to, I can refund at least part of his money. Don't worry about it so much. Let me introduce you to my daughters. This is Patience." Millie indicated the older girl with her long blonde hair and braids. "And our youngest is Grace." She pointed to the little girl sitting on her older sister's lap with her thumb in her mouth. "Well, our youngest so far." She patted her belly affectionately. Charlotte climbed into the sleigh beside the girls. "And you've learned to drive a team of horses? You're so different here." Charlotte looked at Millie with wide eyes, obviously admiring how her friend had grown. "I never would have dreamed of you being one of those independent women who could drive a team." Millie nodded. "I'm a lot different than I was. I love it here. I wouldn't go back to the selfish girl I was for anything." She tucked the quilts around herself and made sure the girls were warm enough. Charlotte looked at her in astonishment. "I never thought you were selfish." Millie had always worked so hard, how could she have been selfish? Millie shrugged. I hid it well. She picked up the reins and started the long drive home. It's a 45-minute drive. Make sure you're covered up well. The countryside was beautiful that December morning. There had been a light snowfall the previous night and the tree branches and ground were covered in untouched snow. Patience shyly pointed out different things on the ride home. She pointed out the few houses they passed and mentioned who lived in each of them. Bess is going to come by tomorrow afternoon for a bit. She's James's sister-in-law. You'll love her. We met, and I knew immediately I'd made a lifelong friend. Millie was very excited for her two closest friends to meet. She pictured years and years of the three of them visiting and letting their children play. She smiled at the thought. Charlotte smiled. I'll look forward to that. Even the thought of meeting James's sister-in-law made her nervous. She'd always been a little shy, but never downright nervous around men before. When they pulled into the yard, George and the two boys came out to be introduced to Millie's friend. George lifted Millie down and turned to her friend, offering her his hand to keep her from slipping on the slick snow. After the introductions were made, George stayed outside to unhitch the team and put the horses in the barn, but the boys went into the house. Millie had baked fresh cookies that morning, and she put on a pot of tea to go with them. Usually I just drink milk with cookies, but I'm so cold, I want a hot drink. Would you rather have tea or milk, Charlotte? Charlotte shrugged, looking around the small house in amazement. When she and Millie had talked about Millie's adventure as a mail-order bride, neither of them had imagined her in a house so small. Millie seemed happy here, though, so Charlotte didn't say anything. I guess I'll have tea if you don't mind. Would she be expected to live in a house this small if she married James? In a few minutes, Millie had tea for her and Charlotte, and milk for the children on the table. They all ate the cookies Millie had fixed that morning. These cookies are good, Millie. Charlotte looked at the cookie as if she didn't believe her friend had made it. Millie smiled. My cooking has improved a great deal during my months here. My family didn't want to starve, so I had to learn quickly. She thought about some of the meals she'd messed up and her eyes twinkled. Your cooking has always been good, Mama. George came in then carrying Millie's purchases from the store. He put them on the work table and, after washing his hands, poured himself a cup of tea, joining them at the table. We're really glad you came to stay with us, Charlotte. Millie's told me a lot about you. Charlotte smiled. I'm so thankful you invited me. I'm really glad I can spend some time with Millie. It's been too long. She smiled at her friend. She couldn't believe how natural Millie seemed in this environment. George seemed like a gentle man, but his face was covered in a scruffy beard. She sat holding her youngest child on what was left of her lap, and cuddled her as she fell asleep there. All the children called her Mama, as if she'd been their mother for years instead of just a few months. Charlotte would never have married a man who had so many children. She needed the man's attention all to herself for a while. Soon, George went back out to the barn, taking the boys with him to help him work. Millie carried Grace into her room and laid her down on her trundle bed on the floor. She and Patience were sleeping together, but with Hugh coming, George went ahead and made her a trundle bed. She'll sleep there happily. Charlotte looked around the room she'd be sharing with the girls and put her things on the bed to be unpacked later, after a nice long visit with her friend. She saw no need to start working now. She deserved a rest after that long train ride. Once Grace was down for her nap, Millie had Patience return to her schoolwork at the table. There's not a school close enough for her to attend, so I'm teaching her, Millie explained. I'll be right back. I need to go down to the cellar to get some vegetables for tonight. Patience jumped up. Let me go, Mama. Papa said you're not supposed to go down to the cellar anymore, because it's not safe for you and the baby. Her voice was eager, making it obvious she wanted nothing more than to please Millie. Millie nodded gratefully. I'll need about 10 good-sized potatoes and 5 or 6 carrots. Carry them in your apron so you don't drop them. Once Patience had shot out of the room, Millie turned back to Charlotte. I really don't know what I'd do without her. Patience came back in, her apron filled with the vegetables. Thank you. Get back to your schoolwork now. Charlotte took in the whole scene with wide eyes. Patience was obviously very protective of Millie, which was nice to see. Patience sat down and immediately began reading from her school book, which was open on the table. George killed a nice-sized buck yesterday, so we're having venison roast for dinner. Millie stood at the sink deftly peeling the carrots and potatoes as she talked. I baked some fresh bread this morning, so we'll have that as well. Charlotte nodded as she watched her friend perform chores she would have been clueless about only a year ago. It sounds wonderful. She'd never eaten venison, but she was more than willing to try it. Meat had been a scarcity at the orphanage, but with George hunting, they'd have access to a lot more meat out here. I bought some cotton today to make some gowns for the baby. I was hoping you'd help me with those. You always had such a good hand with a needle and thread. Millie loved the idea of having an experienced seamstress like Charlotte help her with the baby things. She was certain Charlotte would be able to give her tips that would help her a great deal. I'd be happy to. Millie smiled over her shoulder as she threw another quartered potato into the pot with the roast, which was already half cooked. I've started on a quilt, too. It's all I've been able to do to keep up with the sewing for the family I already have, and this little one is really sapping my energy. Charlotte grinned. You're not as light on your feet as I remember. She couldn't help teasing her old friend. Millie laughed out loud. I'm not light on my feet at all anymore. Sometimes I think I resemble nothing so much as a duck. I waddle everywhere I go. Millie had always thought a lot of her looks, but she'd learned George didn't much care what she looked like. He cared about who she was on the inside. Patience looked up from her schoolwork and smiled at her mother's words. Her face quickly turned to a frown as she saw her mother's friend sitting at the table like an honored houseguest instead of helping out. Her mama needed help. Why was she just sitting there? Once Millie had put the roast back in the oven, Charlotte asked, "What can I do to help you?" Millie smiled and showed her the new fabric she'd purchased. Together, they cut out the gowns for the baby, and they each began to sew one. Patience, watching while she did her schoolwork, frowned again. Her mama needed help with the things that were hard, like cooking and cleaning. She could do the sewing and still rest. They got a lot of the sewing done that afternoon as they caught up. Charlotte filled Millie in on the news from Boston. A new patron had started donating money to the orphanage, and the extra money was helping make some much-needed changes. They were even going to be able to expand it, so they'd be able to take on more children. They talked about how fortunate they'd been that Mrs. Stanton, who had run the orphanage their entire lives, had been unwilling to throw them all on the orphan trains with so many other children. They'd had a good solid upbringing in a Christian orphanage, which was so much more than others got. Millie enjoyed their visit so much, she lost track of time. At 5:15, she jumped up. Oh my! It's almost supper time. Patience, help me clear the table and set it for dinner. Patience jumped up and cleared away her schoolbooks, taking them to her room. Millie put a stack of dishes on the end of the table for Patience to set properly, and then she carefully folded the fabric they'd been using. We'll sew a little more after the children are in bed, if you'd like. She usually sewed during the time George read the Bible to her anyway. Charlotte nodded. She loved to sew. She sat back and watched as Patience flew to get the table set, and Millie took the huge pot with the roast and potatoes out of the oven. I need to make gravy for this. She pulled down a smaller pot and added the drippings from the big one. Slowly she stirred in a mixture of water and flour and added some seasoning. By the time George came in at 5 with the fresh milk in his hand, the table was set and dinner was finished. Patience went to get Grace up from her nap. George noted Charlotte sitting at the table while his wife did all the work, but chalked it up to travel fatigue. Surely she'd start helping out the next day. Maybe he could think of a Bible passage to prod her in that direction. Millie had told him Charlotte was a real Christian, unlike what she'd been before moving to Minnesota. Once they were all seated, George said a quick prayer for them. Thank you, Lord, for the food you have provided and the good friend you've provided to eat it with. We pray in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. They all chorused amen, and Millie quickly filled their plates. Charlotte took a bite of the meat, and her eyes lit up. Millie, this is fabulous. You're a good cook. She was again surprised her friend had developed such culinary skills so quickly. Millie smiled. Thank you. She shared a look with George. Not everything I've made has been edible, but I think I get better all the time. George shook his head. There was only one meal that wasn't edible, but we made do. The rest have been wonderful. Millie beamed under his praise. It still meant a lot to her that he'd find her efficient at her tasks as a wife and mother. Bess will be here in the afternoon tomorrow, so I'll be baking a cake in the morning. Is there anything in particular you'd like for supper tomorrow? George shook his head. Whatever you feel up to making. I don't want you spending a lot of time on your feet making elaborate meals. He hoped Charlotte would take the hint and try and take the burden off his wife. You know, Ellie said you needed to rest more. Who's Ellie? Charlotte asked. She looked between the couple wondering what she was missing. Millie shook her head at George, silently asking him not to say anything else. Ellie is the midwife. Is something wrong? Charlotte continued to look between Millie and George, trying to figure out what wasn't being said. Millie shook her head. Probably not. I'm just more run down than I should be. Of course, I'm pregnant for the first time and taking care of 4 children, and that's probably most of it right there. She shrugged. I wouldn't change it for the world, though. She included all of the children in her smile. Well, you'll need to just sit back and I'll do the work now that I'm here. She smiled at her friend to let her know she would do anything to keep her healthy. She'd have to be taught, of course, but she was a quick study. George nodded satisfied. Even Patience smiled. They were both worried about Millie. Once dinner was done, Millie got to her feet to clear the table, and Patience jumped up to help her. Charlotte started to get up, but decided she'd just be in the way. The two of them worked so efficiently together. So she held little Grace and told her a story while the dishes were being done. Once the children were in bed, Millie and Charlotte once again began sewing for the baby. George pulled his Bible down off the shelf and came to the table to read. I always read to Millie in the evenings after the children are in bed, he told Charlotte by way of explanation. He had a look of concentration on his face as he flipped through the old Bible, trying to find the verses he was looking for. He opened his Bible to Proverbs chapter 31 and read about the qualities of a good wife. Millie was a bit startled, because they were supposed to start reading Acts, but she didn't say anything, just listened quietly. The reading made her think about the ways she could improve as a wife, and she was always looking for ways to do her job better. Once he was finished, he smiled at Millie. I wanted to read this because it points out all the ways my wife does so much good for our family. I'm really proud of the way you've become the wife and mother our family needs you to be. Millie smiled at his words. She'd wondered momentarily if he was chastising her by reading them, but she'd realized quickly George wouldn't have done that in front of her friend. He would have waited until they were alone to speak to her about it. He excused himself and went to bed soon after that, and Millie, stifling a yawn, got up to go to bed as well. Morning comes awfully early on a farm. I need to head to bed, too. Is there anything you need? Charlotte shook her head. I'm fine. I'll see you in the morning. She sat thinking about the scriptures George had read and how proud he was of Millie. She wanted to be the kind of wife Proverbs chapter 31 talked about. That meant she needed to learn to do everything Millie did. She was glad she had such a good friend to teach her. Chapter 2. The sun wasn't even up yet when Charlotte heard Millie and George stirring in the room beside hers. She quickly dressed and met Millie in the kitchen. Millie was wearing her coat and shoes. Where are you going? Why would anyone be up at this hour? I need to go collect the eggs so I can cook breakfast. Millie opened the door. I'll go with you this morning so you can show me where they lay, but I'll get them from now on. Charlotte made a statement rather than offering. She knew Millie was used to doing things for herself and would have a hard time accepting help. Millie smiled at her. Thank you. That'd be nice. Charlotte shrugged on her coat, and they went out into the cold morning together. Millie showed her all the places the hens liked to hide the eggs, and they laughed as they competed to see who could find the most, as they had in the orphanage. Once the basket was full, they rushed back into the house. George had already started the stove to heat the room. He didn't say anything, just went out the door and into the yard. Where's he going in the cold? What was wrong with these people? They couldn't sleep until the sun was up or stay in where it was warm. Well, since the stove had just started heating, it definitely wasn't warm yet, but it was better than it was outside. He's milking the cow. We need the fresh milk for breakfast, Millie explained. She cracked all but 3 of the eggs into a mixing bowl and held it against her huge stomach as she mixed them quickly. What are you making? Charlotte watched her carefully so she could hopefully do this on her own tomorrow. Scrambled eggs. We have scrambled eggs and toast every day, but Sunday. I make pancakes on Sundays. What should I do to help? Charlotte wished she could just take over and tell Millie to sit, but she had no clue how to put breakfast on the table. Millie wasn't used to having help with breakfast. She always let Patience sleep in a bit, knowing the girl needed her sleep. No matter how old she acted, she was still only 7. Why don't you put the skillet on the stove with a pat of butter to get it heating? And then you can cut up slices of bread and butter them. Charlotte went to work on the bread after setting the skillet on to heat. Where should I put them once they're buttered? Millie set the eggs down and handed her friend a long pan. Just lay them on there and we'll put the pan in the oven. She added salt and pepper to the eggs and mixed them some more. I'm going to go wake the children. As soon as you're finished, put the pan into the oven. Charlotte had never really used an oven before, because she'd rarely helped out in the kitchen at the orphanage. Her job was always the mending and sewing of the children's clothing, because she'd shown skill at that from a very young age. She'd never volunteered to do more work or learn extra things as Millie had. She took the rag Millie had used for opening the oven and opened it and slid the pan inside. She then closed the door, hoping she'd done it correctly. George came back and set the milk on the work surface while Millie was waking the children. When Millie came back, she mixed in the milk and poured the eggs into the heated pan. Would you like me to watch the eggs? Millie nodded, smiling. Just stand over them and use a spoon to push them around to keep them from sticking to the pan. Millie took down the plates and efficiently set the table, watching her friend out of the corner of her eye. Charlotte was here to help, yes, but she was also here to learn the skills she needed to be a good wife. Millie was happy to be the one to teach her. By the time the children were dressed and at the table, the eggs and toast were done. Charlotte served them all, while Millie poured milk into all the cups. Charlotte had watched carefully as Millie stirred the eggs and added the seasoning and milk. She was sure she'd be able to make breakfast for them the following day without help from Millie. The family ate quickly. Once breakfast was done, Millie stood to clear the table, but Charlotte stopped her. I'm here to help. Why don't you play with Grace while I wash the dishes? She noticed Patience immediately stood to help her. Millie smiled, happy to have some time to just sit and play with Grace. They talked quietly and stacked some empty spools while Charlotte and Patience worked. Patience was looking at Charlotte with a new respect today, which pleased Millie. She knew Patience had been annoyed with Charlotte yesterday, and she understood why, but she felt Patience needed to show every adult respect. Once the dishes were done, Patience sat at the table, once again studying her schoolwork. Millie gathered the ingredients to bake the cake she'd promised George she'd be making today. She no longer needed the recipes she'd written out, but she took them out and showed them to Charlotte, and the two women mixed the ingredients together, Charlotte carefully following the instructions. Millie sat and watched, softly explaining each step as her friend did the work. Once the cake was in the oven, Millie uncovered a pot of beans she'd soaked the night before. I'm going to make a big pot of beans for lunch today. She turned to Patience. Would you go down to the cellar and bring back some bacon for me? Patience immediately rushed off to do as she was asked. Charlotte looked at Millie with a smile. She's a blessing. She's such an obedient child, and so willing to work. Millie nodded. She was like that when I got here. I take no credit. I've taught her to do a lot of things, but she's really been a help in so many ways. Once Patience was back with the thick slab of bacon, Millie sat at the table and began cutting it into small chunks. I'd normally stand as I do this, but I'm trying to stay off my feet as much as possible. She felt badly for not being able to show Charlotte the proper way of doing it. Charlotte looked around for another knife. I can help cut it. Millie shook her head. I can do this easily. Would you mind making the beds and sweeping the rooms for me? Charlotte looked at her for a moment and nodded. She hated cleaning, and Millie knew it, but it was something needing to be done, and Millie shouldn't do it. Patience was probably old enough, but she needed to be doing her schoolwork. George had the boys with him again. As she swept, Charlotte thought about all the things necessary for keeping a small house going. Between the cooking and the cleaning and the mending, Millie didn't seem to have much time to do anything else. Would her life be like that if she married James? There just seemed to be so many more chores to be done here than there were back in Boston. Of course, being raised in an orphanage was different. There were so many hands to do the work, it seemed to always make the job lighter. When Charlotte was finished, she returned to the kitchen just as Millie was putting all the pieces of bacon into the water with the beans. She moved the pot onto the middle of the stove to begin the long cooking process. The cake should be ready to come out of the oven. Do you want to do it, Charlotte? A worried look crossed Charlotte's face, but she nodded. Carefully opening the oven, she removed the cake and set it on the work surface to cool. Will we put icing on it? Millie shook her head. I usually just put some preserves on top. It's tastier that way. We have apple, strawberry, blueberry, blackberry, or grape. Which would you prefer? Blackberry sounds good. Charlotte had always been partial to blackberries, and desserts weren't exactly abundant in the orphanage. Millie smiled. We'll send Patience down for some blackberries after lunch. I'll go now, Mama. Patience got to her feet to run to help. Millie shook her head. I want you to concentrate on your schoolwork if you can. She stood and retrieved her sewing basket from along the wall. I thought we could sew until it's closer to lunchtime. The two women worked and chatted happily until almost noon. Charlotte loved this kind of work, but didn't much care for housework. Cooking was something she was unsure of, but she knew as she gained proficiency, she wouldn't mind it much. So tell me where James will take me as we court. Charlotte tried not to sound too eager, but meeting James was all she could think about. Millie shrugged. Most of the courting around here is done with a chaperone in a buggy or on a sleigh. He'll probably come for you, and we'll send either Patience or one of the boys out with you. You'll drive for a few hours, and then he'll bring you home. You can invite him for a meal if you'd like. There isn't much more than that to do. Charlotte sighed. She didn't feel all that strongly about needing a chaperone, but she was living under George's roof, and if he thought she needed one, she'd take one. She meant to talk to him about it, though, and see if he would be okay with her going alone. Do you think he'll call for me on Sunday afternoon? Millie had already explained that Sunday was the only day of rest. Only housework and chores were done on Sundays. No farm work could be done at all. Millie laughed. From the way he was talking last Sunday, he's already mapped out the route he wants to take you on. Her eyes twinkled at her friend. Charlotte blushed. I hope I can live up to his expectations of me. You will. I think he'll just be happy if you can cook a few basic meals, and he can quit eating at Bess's house for supper every night. She paused and winked at her friend. I know that would make Bess happy. Because she wants her house to herself or because she gets tired of cooking for an extra person all the time? Yes. Both women dissolved into laughter. Patience looked up from her book with a grin. Her mama was serious too much. It was nice to see her laughing with her friend. Millie looked at her friend. It was so hard for her to ask for help, even though she knew she really needed it. Would you mind making the cornbread for lunch? I'll walk you through how to do it. Charlotte nodded reluctantly. It wasn't that she didn't want to help Millie, because she did, but she wasn't sure exactly how to go about cooking, and doing things she was unsure of made her uncomfortable. Of course, it was better to learn with her friend coaching her than it would be as a new wife with a husband who needed to eat every night. She took down the bowl and gathered the ingredients Millie told her to get. She broke the first egg and had to fish the shells out of the bowl. "Are you sure you want me doing this?" Millie grinned. "You just need practice. You'll be a great cook in no time." Patience looked skeptical, but didn't say anything. Once the cornbread was in the oven, Millie stood and gathered their sewing into her sewing basket to set off to the side of the room. She took out the dishes to set the table. After a moment, Charlotte took the dishes from her. "Why don't you just rest while I do this?" Millie nodded gratefully and sank back to her seat. Grace had been playing quietly in the corner all morning and came over to climb onto Millie's lap. "Mama?" "Yes, baby? I want the baby to come so you'll have a lap again." She rested her head on Millie's shoulder, hanging on tightly for fear she'd fall off. Millie laughed and hugged Grace closer. "I know, Gracie. It'll happen soon. Of course, then the baby will be on Mama's lap a lot." She didn't want the little girl to think she'd always get to sit on her lap once the baby was born. She didn't want her to resent her younger sibling. Grace nodded. "I know. But when it's my turn, I can have a whole lap." Patience removed her school books from the table and took them into her room. She helped Charlotte finish setting the table, and put the butter on and the milk as well. Once the cornbread was done, Patience went out to call her brothers and father to eat. They all stomped their feet at the door to remove most of the snow, and came inside. George sniffed the air. "Smells good. Is that cornbread?" George loved to eat cornbread with his beans. Millie nodded toward her friend. "Charlotte made it." George smiled at Charlotte. "Thank you for helping out so much while she's having to rest." He was so glad the Bible verses had helped her. He wouldn't have been able to let her stay if she was just causing more work and not helping. Millie wasn't healthy enough for that. "I'm happy to help. I just wish I knew more about cooking. I've never done much of it, so I feel a little nervous." Charlotte was a little embarrassed to admit that, but she wanted him to understand her better. "We're happy to have you practice on our family." He washed his hands at the basin before sitting down. After their lunch, Charlotte and Patience did the dishes, while Millie lay down with Grace for a few minutes to help her sleep. After she'd closed the door quietly behind her, Millie looked around the main room. Everything looked just right. Patience and Charlotte had worked to make sure all the cleaning was done in the few minutes she'd been with Grace. Millie thanked her friend and hugged Patience. "You've been the best daughter I ever could have dreamed of. Thanks for taking care of me." Over Patience's head she mouthed the words, "Thank you," to her friend. Patience smiled her pleasure at the compliment and went to get her school books. She would study until Bess came, but then she got to participate in the women's conversation, which was something she always looked forward to. Charlotte was nervous and kept smoothing down her dress. Millie was so engrossed in her sewing she didn't notice the first few times. Finally she said, "Stop fidgeting, Charlotte. Bess is going to love you as much as I do." Charlotte laughed at herself and sat down at the table to do her sewing as well. She'd almost finished the first gown. Millie had purchased enough fabric for 5, so she would do as many as she could. The door opened, and Bess called in. "It's me." Bess never knocked when she was expected, just as Millie didn't knock at her home. There was no need for either of them to stand outside in the cold when she knew perfectly well how to open a door. After the introductions were made, Bess settled into a chair at the table and picked up her own sewing. After her first visit with Millie, she'd taken to bringing her own sewing basket for their visits, because neither of them felt right about sitting with their hands idle when they could be getting something accomplished. Their sewing went so much faster when they had each other to laugh with. Bess turned to Charlotte. "James is really excited about you being here. He can hardly wait until Sunday morning to meet you." Charlotte smiled. "I'm excited, too, but more nervous than anything. I hope he doesn't feel like he wasted his money on my fare." She liked Bess. Her eyes seemed to dance with happiness. She couldn't help but be drawn to her. Bess smiled encouragingly. "Of course, he won't. He'll just be proud he gets to be the one to beau you around while you're here. I do hope you two fall in love and you stay forever, of course. I need a sister. Millie was pleased to see her friends getting along so well. Of course, she'd known they would. Would you care for some cake, Bess? Bess grinned, her hand going to her slightly rounded stomach. I think Junior and I would be thrilled to have some cake. Bess was only a couple of months along. The women joked constantly how their children would grow up and get married. Millie turned to Patience, who was sitting quietly soaking in every word the three women were saying. Would you run down to the cellar and bring up a jar of blackberry preserves? Patience ran off to do as she was asked, worried she'd miss some little piece of the adult conversation. Bess taught me to ken this summer. If you stay, we'll teach you together. Charlotte smiled. I'd like that a lot. I hope James won't mind getting a wife who knows nothing about cooking. Bess shrugged. As long as you're willing to learn, he won't mind at all. Of course, after a couple of months here with Millie, I'm sure you'll be one of the best cooks around. Patience ran in then with the preserves. Millie stood to get the cake, but Charlotte stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. Rest. I'll get the cake. Charlotte dished up a large slice for everyone. Should I get some for George and the boys? Millie shrugged. Normally they didn't come into the house while Bess was visiting, but she was certain they'd enjoy a piece of the cake as well. Yes, please. If you don't mind. She turned to her daughter, and saw she was already heading out the door to get her father and brothers. They all had a cup of milk to go with the cake. Millie turned to Bess. Were you too cold on the way over? Do you want me to have George take you home in the sleigh? Bess laughed. John dropped me off on his way to town. He said he'd stop back for me on his way home. She rubbed her belly again. I need to be carrying a baby more often. I like the special treatment. They all laughed. Don't get too used to it, George joked. I'm sure John doesn't want to have to pamper his wife forever. Bess grinned at the light-hearted teasing. George and John had been neighbors since long before John and Bess had married. I'll just be glad when we get all the sewing done for your baby, so Millie can start helping me with mine. Charlotte watched the light-hearted way everyone dealt with each other with a smile. This was something she'd never seen in Boston. There wasn't as much work to be done, sure, but there also wasn't this camaraderie that came from working so hard together, and helping one another. She started thinking Minnesota looked like a good place to stay after all. John knocked on the door while they were still eating their cake, so Millie invited him in for a piece. Charlotte immediately jumped up to serve him when she saw Millie trying to get up out of the chair. She wanted to laugh at her friend for the way she got up with her body at an angle belly first, but knew better. Millie had been the prettiest girl in school back in Boston, and had never seemed particularly vain, but Charlotte was sure she wouldn't take kindly to someone making fun of her ungainly movements. John was tall with dark hair and brown eyes. Charlotte found herself watching him and hoping his brother had similar looks. She'd always been partial to men with brown eyes. When John and Bess stood to leave, Bess gave Charlotte an impulsive hug. I sure hope you'll end up being my sister-in-law. Charlotte smiled. I hope so too. Of course, she'd have to decide that later. She couldn't exactly marry someone just because she wanted a sister. Chapter 3. Sunday morning came all too soon for Charlotte. She wanted to meet James, but she was so nervous about it, she wasn't sure if she could sit still for the church service. Before leaving Boston, she'd taken a portion of her meager earnings and purchased enough fabric for a new dress. She'd worked painstakingly on it for 2 weeks, and had finally finished up the hemming on the train on the way to Minnesota. After the breakfast dishes were done, she'd slipped into the girls' room to change into her dress. It was a forest green and she had a new bonnet to go with it. She carefully wove her hair into an intricate braid and set the bonnet on top. She wished there was a mirror here to see into, but there wasn't a single mirror in the house. She went into the main room where Millie was braiding Grace's hair while Patience looked on. Patience looked up and smiled. You look beautiful. Charlotte grinned. Thank you, Patience. She looked to Millie for a response. Millie nodded. You look very nice, Charlotte. James will be happy he sent you the tickets. Millie could see how nervous her friend was, and hoped she'd be able to calm down before they arrived at the church. Charlotte was almost floating on the compliments. George looked at her and nodded. She hadn't expected a compliment from George. He wasn't the type to compliment a woman who wasn't his wife. She doubted if even Millie heard compliments from him about her appearance very often. "We need to leave in 5 minutes. I'll go hitch up the team." Both boys, in their Sunday best, followed George outside to help. Charlotte watched them go. "Are they ever any real help to him?" Millie smiled. "They will be in a couple of years. Right now, they're still learning." She finished the braid. "There. You look very pretty, Gracie." They all bundled up in their coats and walked out to where the sleigh was waiting. George carefully helped Millie into the seat and handed Grace to her. Charlotte sat in the back with the boys. "I'm going to have to make a bigger sleigh if we have any more children." George gave Millie a look of love that made Charlotte want to sigh aloud. She wanted someone who would love her the way George loved Millie. George made sure they were all tucked carefully under the quilts. The ride to church would be way too cold without the covers on them. Charlotte was nervous the whole way into town. The boys chattered with her about their friends they'd see in church, and how much they loved Sundays. Their non-stop litany helped to calm her nerves, because she had to think of something other than meeting James. Once the sleigh was stopped in front of the small church, Charlotte saw Bess standing with John, and a man who must surely be his brother. She led them over to the sleigh, and made the introductions in her quiet sweet voice. James offered his hand to help Charlotte down from the sleigh. James had dark hair and brown eyes, which thrilled Charlotte to no end. She loved brown eyes. His hand was firm, but gentle, as he helped her down from the sleigh. He tucked her arm through his and led her toward the church, not leaving her with Millie to make introductions. She couldn't believe he was being so bold. She'd expected Millie to introduce her around, but maybe James felt the need to introduce her to let everyone know he'd be courting her. He introduced her around quickly. There were only about 15 families in the church and several single farmers. There were no single females of marriageable age at all. It would be nice to have other young females to make friends with, but it made sense there were none. If there had been, there'd have been no need for her or Millie to come out here. She shook Pastor Jenkins's hand and smiled. Unlike Millie, Charlotte had always loved going to church, and she'd accepted Jesus as her savior at a young age. She told Pastor Jenkins she was looking forward to his sermon. He stepped up to the pulpit, and she wondered if James was going to keep her with him through the service. She'd never seen a courting couple sit together at church, but maybe things were different out here. James led her back to Millie and promised to see her after the sermon. She breathed a sigh of relief when he returned her. He seemed nice, but very proprietary, and it made her nervous. Charlotte sat very still and listened intently to the sermon about women being helpers to their husbands and praising God by the way they take care of their homes. She determined then and there to learn as much from Millie as she possibly could, so she could do what she needed to do to take care of her home after marriage. Even if she didn't marry James, she would eventually marry, and the skills she'd learn would be invaluable. After the sermon, James appeared at her side. "May I take you for a sleigh ride this afternoon? I know it's cold, but I'll keep you well covered." James seemed nervous as he asked, which surprised Charlotte. She felt like his paying for her ticket had purchased some of her time. Even if she'd met him and had known immediately she would never marry him, she would have felt the need to spend time with him. She looked to Millie. "Would that be okay? Do you need me for anything?" She knew Millie would agree, but she felt like her first priority was helping out with Millie's family if at all necessary. She could see dark circles forming under her friend's eyes even though her load had lightened considerably since her arrival. "Go ahead. I can handle my family for a day." She looked to George. "That's okay with you?" George nodded. He didn't like the idea of a woman under his protection going out alone with a young man, though. "You'll need to take Patience with you as a chaperone." Patience couldn't be a proper chaperone, of course, but she was better than nothing. Millie certainly wasn't up to going for a long sleigh ride, and he wouldn't leave her without adult help. Patience was off giggling with one of her young friends. Charlotte looked in her direction and smiled. She was such a dependable young girl, it was good to see her laughing and having fun when the opportunity arose. Charlotte met James's chocolate brown eyes then and nodded. She was glad Millie had warned her about needing a chaperone for their drives. "I'd be happy to go. What time will you call for me?" James seemed to consider the question for a moment. "Around 2? That'll give me time to eat lunch and then head over." Charlotte looked at Millie for a moment, wondering if it would be okay to invite James for lunch. She didn't know what her friend had planned, though, and decided she'd save that for another time. 2 sounds good. I'll be watching for you so you don't have to leave the team out in the cold. Charlotte spent the drive back to Millie's staring out at the landscape. It was cold, but spending a few hours with James would be worth the cold. He was better looking than she could have hoped for. She couldn't believe her luck. They had a cold lunch of bread with jam. Halfway through lunch, Millie asked, "Before you go, would you be willing to help me get supper started? I want to make a large pot of soup, but I have a hard time standing long enough to peel the vegetables." Of course. Charlotte was slightly annoyed, because she'd wanted to wear her pretty new dress for the drive, but she'd have to change into a work dress now. She needed to help Millie, though. "I have a huge apron you can wear, so you won't have to change your clothes." Millie smiled at her friend, knowing what she was thinking. Charlotte was instantly ashamed. Millie's family was providing for her, and all they asked was for a little help in return. She should be doing everything with a smile and acting thankful she was given the opportunity. That would be nice. Once Charlotte and Patience had done the lunch dishes, Patience went down to the cellar and the two of them began peeling carrots and potatoes. Millie turned to George. "I hate to ask, but would you mind bringing some peas and some salt pork up from the cellar?" George dropped a kiss on top of his wife's head. It was the first sign of affection Charlotte had seen them exchange, and it made her feel a lot better for her friend's lot in life. She could tell Millie was very happy here with her new family, but for the life of her, she couldn't figure out why she enjoyed working so hard for children who weren't even her own. Millie was a much more loving person than anyone back home had given her credit for. Millie sat at the table, and once each carrot and potato was peeled, it was given to Millie, who chopped it up quickly and efficiently and dropped it into a huge pot for the soup. By the time 2 came around, the pot was in the center of the stove and Millie knew she'd be fine just stirring it occasionally. She hugged her friend tightly. "Thanks for helping before you left. Have a great time." Patience got dressed in her warmest clothes, including a scarf, to cover her face. Millie sent her out with 2 extra quilts, in case James didn't include enough for them. Millie stood at the door watching as James helped the 2 young ladies into his sleigh. Patience sat at the far right and Charlotte in the middle. James tucked the quilts around both of them tightly, and away they went. Millie said a quick prayer asking God to help her friend determine if James was the man he had for her. She would love to have Charlotte living so close, but not if it was against his will. The boys played quietly in a corner for the afternoon, while Grace napped. Millie and George sat at the table, and Millie worked on piecing the quilt she was making for the baby. "What do you think of my friend?" The words were spoken quietly to make sure the boys didn't hear them. George looked up from the paper he was reading and sighed. "I think she's been a lot more helpful the past couple of days. That first day, I was ready to send her right back to Boston." He paused for a minute, rubbing his temple. "That's one complaint I've never had about you, Millie. You have never complained about any of the work you've been asked to do. You've just put on your apron, rolled up your sleeves, and gotten to work. Charlotte's a hard worker, too, but she's never had to do most of the type of work I do here. She's always been such a good seamstress. She was given the job of mending clothes or making new clothes. No one ever considered taking her away from the job she was best at." She pulled her needle through the quilt, smiling at the way the small quilt was taking shape. "She's not lazy. She just needs to learn." George grunted. "She did seem to really pay attention to the sermon today. That's in her favor." Millie just smiled. "Give her a little time. She'll be cooking and cleaning circles around me." "She'd better be. You're supposed to be off your feet as much as possible." Millie laid down her sewing and stood to stir the soup for a moment. How would you feel about having Bess and John and James over for Christmas dinner? George looked around and thought about it. We could do that. I can hunt a wild turkey if you want. Millie nodded eagerly. That would be wonderful. And I'll make dressing and potatoes and gravy. A couple of Christmas pies. He immediately began shaking his head. No, you won't. If we do it, you have to have Charlotte and Patience do the cooking. You can sit right there and supervise them. Any cooking that can be done sitting down, you're welcome to do. Otherwise, I want you resting. Millie sighed, rubbing her stomach. It's so hard to sit and watch everyone else doing for me. I want to jump up and help them. She sat down across from George, wishing she didn't have to be babied so much. Millie, I've been through 4 pregnancies with Martha, and not one of them scared me like this one does. You had those fainting spells before Charlotte got here, and we just can't risk that happening again. Our baby needs her mama to be there for her whole life. The fear in George's eyes had Millie covering his hand with hers. I'm going to be okay. He shook his head. You need to rest more. You should be taking naps every day, but instead you're out here supervising the housework and cooking. Charlotte can handle things. Just get her started, and then you climb in bed with Grace, and take the nap the midwife wants you to take. She sighed. Patience is already so worried. If I started napping every day, it would be even worse for her. She paused, not sure how to say the next words. She's so afraid of losing another mother. George nodded. I'm just as scared of losing another wife. You need to nap. I'll talk to Patience. Millie nodded, resuming her sewing of the quilt. I'm really glad Charlotte is here to help. Just so she helps and doesn't add work, I'm happy, too. James seemed to be a man of few words. Charlotte asked him question after question, and got short one-sentence answers. He must be shy, she thought. After 30 minutes of trying, she finally hit on a topic that got him talking. How do you like farming? I love it. I couldn't imagine being anything but a farmer. God meant for us to work the land. I have a big farm, and my brother and I help each other out at harvest time. I enjoy walking behind the plow and watching the dirt turn over. I love planting the crops and watching them break from the ground. Is there anything you'd change about your farm? Since the farm topic seemed to be working for him, she'd continue asking questions until she couldn't think of any more. He thought about that for a moment before answering. The main thing my farm doesn't have that it needs is a wife. I need someone to be there in the evenings when I come home. I want what my brother has. Not Bess, of course. She's too much like a sister to me. I love how my brother knows he's got a good meal waiting every night. I know Bess gets tired of cooking for me, too. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. I'm just now learning to cook. Millie's teaching me. She felt like she needed to let him know she wasn't an expert cook, so he wouldn't want to jump into a marriage with someone who wasn't what he was expecting. Word around these parts is Millie is a fabulous cook. You couldn't have a better teacher. Patience didn't say anything, but sat smiling. She was proud of her new mama and wasn't shy about admitting it. I'm always shocked at how much work goes into being a farmer's wife. Millie does more in one day than most of the women I knew in Boston do in a week. Of course, she had 4 children as soon as she married. She smiled at Patience. I don't know what she'd do without Patience to help her. Millie started out with more work than most, because of the extra children, but it's a lot of work for anyone. A farmer and his wife work from sun up to sundown 6 days a week. There's one day of frivolity, and that's Sunday. His voice was clear, and even as he talked about his life. It was one he loved, and he made that obvious, but he wasn't shy about admitting there was hard work involved. Charlotte nodded. She'd seen that, and honestly wasn't sure it was what she wanted. She decided to keep those thoughts to herself, though. She may not be suited to be a farmer's wife. Living in a city may suit her a lot better, and she needed to think hard about that. By the time James dropped her and Patience off at the house, it was almost supper time. She hadn't asked Millie about inviting James in for supper, so she smiled and thanked him for the ride. Patience jumped down on her own and ran into the house to warm herself. I really enjoyed getting to know you. She hoped he wouldn't think her words were too bold. His gloved hand covered her mittened one. Would you be willing to go again next Sunday? His eyes met hers steadily as he asked the question. His nerves seemed to have disappeared during the long ride. She nodded eagerly. I'd love that. I'm sure Patience would enjoy it as well. I'll plan on calling for you around 2 again then. He got down from the sleigh and held her hand to steady her as she climbed down. I'll see you Sunday. She nodded shyly. Next Sunday. She turned and forced herself to walk gracefully into the house, when what she really wanted to do was run. Sometimes it was hard acting like a lady. Chapter 4. The following afternoon, Millie brought up the idea of having Bess and John over for Christmas dinner along with James. You'd have to do the cooking, though. George is very insistent about me staying off my feet as much as possible. He's lost one wife, and the thought of losing another terrifies him. Charlotte looked at her friend. Are you in that kind of danger? She knew Millie hadn't been well, but the idea of losing her friend had never occurred to her. Millie shrugged. The midwife is worried. I've had some fainting spells, and I'm getting a lot more tired than I should be. I'm sure it's all nothing, but no one will listen to me. I'm going to make sure you stay off your feet then. You can tell me everything I need to do from your chair. She paused for a moment, thinking about the original topic. I do like the idea of everyone coming for Christmas dinner as long as you can walk me through cooking it. I'm hoping I can talk George into getting us 2 turkeys so you can practice on one before the big day. Also, if we're inviting others, we need to think about what we're going to do for Christmas gifts for everyone. We have to have gifts for them if they're going to be here. Charlotte sat for a moment and thought about it. I have some pretty yarn I purchased in Boston, and I could make Bess a shawl. It could be from all of us. She'd planned on using the yarn to knit a sweater for herself, but she'd much rather make something for Bess. Millie nodded, getting into the spirit of things. I love that idea. I could knit a pair of socks for James, because he has no one to do that for him. No, wait. I'll knit a shawl for Bess, and you make James some socks. It would mean more coming from you. She grinned at her friend. John, though, what could we do for John? I noticed his necktie at church yesterday was a little frayed. I could make him a necktie. She thought for a moment. I don't really have any fabric that would work, though. Do you have a scrap bag? Millie nodded to a bag in the corner. Charlotte went over and dug through it until she found some dark fabric. What about this? Millie grinned. That's perfect. That's what we'll do then. I'll ask Bess about it when she comes tomorrow afternoon. She was excited at having her friend there for Christmas dinner. She felt like a sister to her, and Christmas time was for family. Charlotte looked at Millie in surprise. I didn't know she was coming tomorrow. She always comes on Tuesday afternoons, and we spend the afternoon sewing together. She only came last Friday because she wanted to meet you before James did. George and the boys came stomping into the house then. It's colder than it's been. We need to get warm by the stove for a minute before we go back out. Millie smiled. She was glad they'd come back, because she had a question for George. How would you feel about trying to hunt 2 turkeys? We have 2 weeks before Christmas, and it would be nice if Charlotte could have a turkey to practice on before she's cooking for such a big crowd. George looked at Millie, thinking about it. Why don't I take Michael this afternoon, and we'll see what we can find? George rested his hand on his older son's shoulder as he asked. He's been wanting to try his hand at real hunting and not just shooting the targets I've made with that new rifle of his. For Michael's 6th birthday, George had bought him a rifle, just the perfect size for him. They had spent many hours practicing shooting at targets, and Michael had been begging to go out and hunt for Raoul. Millie nodded. I think Michael's more than ready. Maybe he can bring home Christmas dinner. She looked at him sternly. Just remember, you clean whatever you kill. Michael nodded enthusiastically. I will, Mama. His eyes danced with excitement over the proposed hunting trip. Jacob can stay inside with us girls this afternoon. We're baking bread today. She looked at Jacob. Would you like to bake your own loaf? Jacob loved to take a small piece of the dough and add sugar and butter and cinnamon and see what he could come up with. Jacob nodded. He was obviously torn between wanting to go with his father and brother, and knowing he needed to stay behind. I'll stay and help, Mama. He sighed. I can't wait until I'm big enough to hunt with Papa. Jacob put a hand on each boy's shoulder. It's time for us men to go back out and get back to work. There's so much to do. Charlotte looked at Millie once they were gone. What do they do out there all day anyway? Millie smiled. They're making Christmas presents. I'm not allowed to know what, though. Charlotte smiled. Bread. How do I make bread? Millie looked at Patience. Would you go get my bread recipe for Charlotte? Patience jumped up to do as she was bid. Millie lowered her voice. Patience loves to help knead the bread, so if you'd include her, that would be good. I'll help as well. I can do that sitting down. Charlotte nodded. Sounds good. The bread was still rising as they ate their lunch at noontime. Michael was practically bouncing up and down in his chair, because he was so excited about going hunting. Millie had to reprimand him twice to get him to slow down and stop eating so quickly. Once they were gone, Millie took the small amount of dough they'd held in reserve for Jacob, and let him add whatever he wanted to it. He was 5 now, and so hated not being able to do everything his big brother and Papa did. It was almost supper time before the men returned from the hunt. Michael's face was glowing as he stomped off his feet and opened the door. Mama. I shot a turkey, and so did Papa. We have 2. That's wonderful. We'll eat yours for supper tomorrow. Millie smiled at Charlotte. She would get to try to cook a turkey for the first time. Michael shook his head. Papa said we're saving mine for Christmas, because it's bigger. Millie grinned. Wow. You shot Christmas dinner. You're practically grown up. Papa said I could tell you, and then I had to go out and help him clean the turkeys. He turned and ran back outside, slamming the door behind him. Charlotte and Millie laughed and laughed. His enthusiasm for his first kill was contagious. So, Michael shot his first turkey, and that means you get to cook your first turkey. Millie grinned at her friend, watching for her reaction. Are turkeys hard to cook? Millie shook her head. Not terribly. I'll walk you through it. We'll be able to eat on a turkey for a few days. Tomorrow you get to learn to make turkey, and then Wednesday, I'll teach you to make turkey pot pie, and on Thursday turkey soup, and Friday we'll have turkey sandwiches. Charlotte grinned. I think I see where this is going. It won't be so bad on Christmas, because there will be so many of us eating it. She looked down at her sewing, confident Charlotte had dinner in hand. Why don't you invite James to lunch on Sunday? We could start a nice big pot of turkey and dumplings before church, and he could try your cooking for the first time. You know what the cook at the orphanage always said. Charlotte shook her head. No. I rarely had any time with her. Millie grinned and put on the high falsetto voice of the cook she'd loved so well. If you ever want a man to fall in love with you, there's only one way to make it happen. Feed him. Charlotte smiled. No, she never said that to me. Patience looked up from her schoolbooks. Do you think that's true, Mama? Millie shook her head. It's true that men like to eat, but there's a lot more they want from a wife than just a good meal. Patience nodded, and looked back down at her books. Millie winked at Charlotte, loving the playfulness she felt when her childhood friend was around. Chapter 5. Bess loved the idea of spending Christmas with the Stevens family. I'll have to ask John, of course, but I'm sure he'll agree. She took a bite of the cookie Charlotte had made for her visit that morning. What can I bring? Millie thought about that. You don't need to bring anything. Bess shook her head. I insist. How about I bring a dessert? You can never have too many desserts on Christmas. That would be fine. She showed Bess the finished gowns for the baby, and the almost finished quilt. What do you think? Bess smiled, nodding enthusiastically. You're fortunate to have all the diapers and furniture you need for the baby. I'm going to have to do a lot of work to get ready. They talked happily for a few minutes about their preparations, but Millie realized they'd left Charlotte out and changed the subject. So tell us about your sleigh ride with James? What do you think of him? Charlotte turned red, obviously uncomfortable with the new topic. She poked her needle into the shirt she was mending for Jacob. He's not easy to get talking. Bess laughed. Once he knows you, he'll never shut up. I can barely get a word in edgewise between John and him. She exchanged a glance with Millie over the blush on Charlotte's face. He said he really enjoyed the ride and hoped you could make it a regular Sunday afternoon thing. Charlotte nodded. We're going again next week. I'm going to invite him to lunch at church on Sunday. She paused for a moment. Millie suggested I make turkey and dumplings. Would he like that? Oh yes, he'll like anything you cook for him, really. He's not a picky eater. The only thing I've found he doesn't like is turnips. Charlotte made a mental note never to fix turnips for him. They only had 2 weeks before Christmas, and she was getting a little nervous about it. She'd never had a beau before, and knowing there was a man waiting to take her for a sleigh ride every Sunday, and whom she'd be cooking for on Christmas Day, made her worry she'd do something to ruin things. The turkey turned out to be a big success. Charlotte couldn't believe the huge amount of meat left when she was cleaning up the dishes that evening. Millie hadn't been joking about them eating it for a week to come. At least they'd have a short break from turkey before she had to cook it again for Christmas dinner. That evening, while George read to them from Acts, the two women started on the gifts for their Christmas company. Charlotte used some black wool to knit the socks, while Millie let her knitting needles fly with the beautiful white yarn she would turn into a shawl for Bess. They would have enough time to make what they needed. Millie needed to get into town sometime before Christmas to buy some candy for the children's stockings. After George finished reading the chapter, she asked, "Will you hitch the team for me tomorrow? I need to make a trip into town to get candy for the children's stockings." George shook his head. "I think it would be best if I did it for you. I really want you to stay close to home and rest as much as you can before the baby comes." "You're worrying me." George and Charlotte studied Millie. The circles under her eyes were more pronounced and her face was thinner than it had been. Her belly was still growing, though. "I think you need to eat more." Charlotte blurted out the words without thinking. George nodded. "I agree. I don't think you're eating enough. But I'm huge. Agnes was telling me I'd be big as a house if I keep eating like I am." She hated that Agnes's words had bothered her, but they had. Before Agnes mentioned how big she was, Millie had forced herself to eat a decent amount whether she had an appetite or not. Ever since, she'd just eaten what she felt like eating, which was almost nothing. The constant nausea kept her from having an appetite. George shook his head. "Agnes doesn't know you. She has no idea what you're eating. You can't listen to her. You need to eat more. Your bones are starting to stick out, you're getting so thin. It's only your belly that's getting big, and that's my child in there. She's sucking all the nutrients right out of you." Millie sighed, looking at her hands. It was so hard to eat these days. She just never felt well enough to want to eat. "I'll try." She hated to make everyone worry about her. "Is there anything else you want me to get from town while I'm there?" "I'll go tomorrow." Millie shook her head. "I went last week and got what I needed while I was picking up Charlotte. I couldn't get candy, though, because the girls were with me." "Do you have their other gifts sorted out?" "Yes. I've made what I want them to have. It would just be so nice to have candy for their Christmas stockings." George stood and put the Bible back onto the shelf. "They'll have it." He looked at Charlotte. "Is there anything you need?" Charlotte shook her head. She didn't want to spend any of her money in case she decided to go back home. She'd need every dime she had and more. "I'm going to head into bed then." "I'll see you in the morning, Charlotte." Millie sat knitting for another minute, and then stood. I should go to bed too. Charlotte stood and blew out the lantern. Me too. Mornings come early here. As they went their separate ways, she couldn't keep her mind off Millie. She really did look unwell. She hoped there was nothing wrong with her, or the baby she carried. Chapter 6. Charlotte found herself feeling shy again when she saw James at church on Sunday morning. She'd said she was going to ask him to lunch, and had even started a special lunch with him in mind, but she wasn't sure she could get up the courage to actually do it. She stood chatting with him at the back of the church while she waited for the sermon to begin. Just as Pastor Jenkins walked to the pulpit, she finally blurted out, "Would you like to come to lunch at the Stevens house today?" He smiled and nodded. "I'd be honored." His eyes seemed to jump with excitement that she'd thought to invite him and wasn't just agreeing to what he wanted to do. She hurried to her seat with Millie and her family, holding Grace in her lap, after the little girl fidgeted too much on Millie's. Charlotte thought it was funny how put out the little girl was that her mother's lap was too crowded for her these days. Grace had no problem sitting with Charlotte. The two of them had become close during her time in Minnesota. Once the service was over and they'd sung the final hymn, she stood, putting Grace on her feet on the floor. James came to stand with her and asked George if he would mind if she rode back to their place with him. George shook his head. "Just make sure you take one of the children as a chaperone." James nodded. Patience was already across the church, talking to her friends, but he would ask her when it got closer to time to leave. Many of the people Charlotte had met the week before came over to talk to her and ask her how she liked Minnesota. It was strange. She did like Minnesota, and it wasn't much colder than Boston, but the remoteness of their location made it seem so much colder. She answered everyone's questions, and even had a couple of other single farmers ask her if she'd like to go on a sleigh ride. The first time it happened, her eyes cut to James at the question, but his expression remained shuttered. "I'm sorry. James and I are courting," she answered in a soft voice. Her face was red as she said the words, but they needed to be said to keep all the other bachelors away from her. James smiled and nodded at her words, pleased she'd been so bold. He didn't want the other men to think she was available. When it was time to leave, Charlotte walked to where Patience was talking with her friends, and asked her if she would mind riding home with her and James. Patience's eyes lit up. "I'd love to." Her friends looked at Patience with envy. They loved the idea of going for long sleigh rides, and Patience got to do it every week now. Patience waved goodbye to her friends and went out to get into James's sleigh with Charlotte. "Is he coming for lunch?" she whispered into Charlotte's ear. Charlotte nodded. "I hope you like turkey and dumplings." Charlotte turned toward James to speak as soon as he started the horses. He smiled down at her. "Absolutely. I love it." He paused for a moment. "Actually, I'm just thrilled not to have to eat my own cooking. I make a mean piece of toast, and thankfully Bess keeps me supplied with fresh butter and jam. She also sends home a loaf of bread every couple of days. I'd starve otherwise." He was a lot more open and chatty this week. Maybe it had only been nervousness keeping him so quiet last week. "Are you coming over for Christmas dinner with Bess and John?" He nodded emphatically. "I am. It'll be nice having a houseful on Christmas. My parents moved back east a couple of years back, and took our younger brothers and sisters. It's been odd not having them around, especially during the holidays." Charlotte sighed wistfully. "I don't have any siblings. Millie is the closest thing I've ever had to a sister. Well, if we marry, I'll happily share mine with you." He watched her out of the corner of his eye as he made the suggestion as if to gauge her reaction. She wasn't sure how to react to that, so she said nothing. They pulled up in front of the farmhouse then, and Patience ran inside while James helped Charlotte down. "Thank you." "You're welcome." She led the way inside, and he sat down with Millie and George, who had beaten them home by a few minutes, while Charlotte put on a huge apron and checked the dumplings. The meal had been cooking over a low heat since they'd left for church that morning, and it looked perfect. Charlotte took down the dishes and carefully set the table while James talked with George about the weather. Once she had everything carefully arranged, She sliced several pieces of bread and put butter on the table, then went to call the children for the meal. George asked James to say the blessing, and Charlotte bowed her head, thinking she could be listening to James pray over their meals for the rest of her life. His prayer was short. Father God, we thank you for the meal you have provided for us and the wonderful company we have to share it with. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Charlotte sat next to James and quickly served the meal. She said a quick silent prayer that the food tasted as good as it smelled. She didn't want James to run away screaming because her cooking was bad. She took her first bite with caution, but her eyes widened. This was really good. She gave Millie a wink to thank her for the help. James took his first bite and sighed. This is wonderful. Did you cook it, Charlotte? Charlotte nodded with a blush. Yes, I did. Thank you. She paused, determined to give credit where it was due. Millie walked me through every step. I couldn't have done it without her. I'd have messed it up, whether I had someone helping me or not. He took another large bite, smiling. He was obviously pleased to know Charlotte was capable of making something so tasty. She's really a natural cook. I don't think I learned anything so quickly, Millie told him with a smile. You're a great cook, Mama. Patience protested. Millie shook her head. Before I came here, I'd been helping in the kitchen at the orphanage for 8 years. I'd learned a lot. You guys had the benefit of my great teacher. Charlotte had never cooked anything until a little over a week ago. Patience looked at Charlotte with a new respect. She'd not thought much about Charlotte's past, and had assumed it was the same as the stories her mama had told of the orphanage. It was odd to think they'd been raised in the same home, but had lived so differently from one another. Wait until you see some of Charlotte's needlework. She can do anything with yarn or fabric. I'd been so excited about her coming, because I knew I'd get all the sewing projects I'd been putting off done quickly. Millie smiled at her friend. Charlotte ducked her head to hide her red face. She wished Millie wouldn't praise her so much in front of James. She didn't want him thinking he was getting a perfect woman, because he definitely wasn't. She had a lot of flaws, and he would discover them quickly once they were married. She served the cake she had baked under Millie's tutelage the day before as dessert. By the time he was done eating, James sat back in his chair and patted his belly. That was a fine meal. Thank you all for inviting me. We're glad to have you. George set down his fork. It's nice to have company for meals on occasion. This place seems overrun with women lately. He winked at Millie as he said the last words. He wanted to make sure she knew he was only joking. George and James sat and talked while Charlotte did the lunch dishes with Patience. When they were finished, Charlotte turned to Millie. Would you like me to start supper before we go? Millie shook her head. I was thinking we'd just have French toast. We have some bread that's a little stale and some eggs to use up. It only takes a few minutes to prepare, so you can run off and have fun. Charlotte smiled at her friend and carefully removed her apron. Patience ran to put her coat and hood on. James stood and helped Charlotte into her coat, which Charlotte thought was strange, because she'd been putting on her own coat for years. Millie helped Patience tie her scarf on and the threesome left the others. While they were riding, James turned to Charlotte. I need you to pay special attention to how to make French toast tonight. It's one of my favorite foods. He grinned as he said the words to let her know he was half joking. Charlotte smiled at him. I'll do my best. She noticed they were going in a different direction than they had last time. It's such beautiful country here. James nodded. We lived in New York City until I was 10, but Pop always had a dream of farming. We moved out here then, but the winters were just too harsh for my ma. I thought about going with them, but farming is in my blood. I can't imagine living anywhere else. I'm not sure how I'll do here. I'd never been out of Boston before a couple of weeks ago. It's certainly very different here. I hope you grow to love it as much as I do. His voice was warm and kind as he said the words. Charlotte knew he was hoping she'd agree to marry him. Charlotte smiled. I hope so too. And she found she did hope so. James was such a gentle, caring man that she could easily imagine spending the rest of her life with him. She couldn't honestly say she was in love with him, but she felt that was coming. If she could come to grips with living there and the work it would mean doing every day for the rest of her life, then she would probably marry him if he asked. Patience spoke then for the first time since leaving the house. I hope you decide to stay. Mama is so happy to have you close by. I think it would be good for her. Charlotte smiled at the young girl. She knew Patience had been annoyed with her when she'd first arrived, and having the little girl's approval mattered to her for some reason. Maybe it was because she seemed so grown up and always so willing to work. Charlotte found she really admired her. It would be good for me to be close to your mama, too. I've missed her a lot since she left Boston to marry your papa. Chapter 7. The week and a half leading up to Christmas flew by. Everyone had secret preparations going on but Charlotte. Charlotte had made some gifts before ever leaving Boston, knowing she would be spending Christmas with her friend's family. Millie was really slow-moving now, and had taken to taking long naps in the afternoon. The only blight on the days leading up to Christmas for Charlotte was the visit from the midwife. She examined Millie in the privacy of her room, but came out shaking her head. "May I speak with you privately?" she asked Charlotte. Charlotte nodded, taking Ellie to the room she shared with the girls. "What's going on?" "I'm really not sure. She's just not doing well. And I think that baby is coming a lot sooner than expected." Ellie's withered face showed concern for her patient. Charlotte's eyes widened in alarm. "But it's too soon, isn't it?" The midwife shrugged. "I've seen babies come a month early and survive. We just have to pray." Ellie was an older woman, in her late 50s at least. Her blue eyes showed a wisdom that only years at her profession could bring. "What can I do to make sure the baby doesn't come too soon?" Charlotte was willing to do triple the work she was currently doing to ensure the safety of Millie's baby. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose a baby, and she hoped her friend never had to go through the experience. "I'd like to see her stay in bed until the baby comes, but Millie is too headstrong to ever agree to that. Keep her sitting as much as you can. She said you were here helping out. Anything you can do for her, you need to do." Charlotte nodded. "I will. I've been doing all the cooking and cleaning. She just sits and sews and tells me how to do things." She paused and looked down at her feet. "I'd never cooked a meal before I came here, so she has to instruct me in everything." "That's okay. As long as you're doing the work, she can talk all day. She needs to eat more. She's getting way too thin. Can you poke more food in her? Fix her favorite meals or something?" Charlotte thought it sounded like the midwife was grasping at straws, but she'd try anything. "I'll try. I've been trying to get her to eat more, but she says she just isn't hungry." "Keep trying. Call for me as soon as she goes into labor." "How soon do you think that'll be?" Charlotte closed her eyes while she waited for the answer. Millie wasn't due for another 5 weeks. "I hope she'll last at least another week or two. If she can make it until the 1st, the baby will have a better chance. I hope we'll see you after the 1st then." She sighed. "Will you pray for her please?" Ellie nodded. "I've been praying for a while for that one. First pregnancies are hard a lot, but not like this one." She turned to go, shrugging into the coat she'd had thrown over her arm. "Merry Christmas." Charlotte walked with her to the door. "Merry Christmas." She stood and watched her drive away and put on her own coat. Walking out to the barn, she motioned for George to talk to her. "Ellie said Millie needs to be in bed as much as we can keep her there. I haven't been letting her do any of the work, but Ellie thinks the baby is coming too soon." George sighed. "I'm worried about the same thing. Thanks for telling me. We really appreciate your help." Charlotte went slowly back into the house. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, and she wanted to make sure the house was immaculate. It would help Millie stay in bed if everything was done around her. Millie was just settling back down at the table when Charlotte stepped back into the house. Patience was playing in the corner with Grace, and the boys were outside with their father. "Ellie said she wanted you in bed as much as possible." Charlotte gave Millie her sternest look, letting her know she wanted her to follow orders as carefully as possible. Millie shrugged. She told me if I won't stay in bed, then I had better stay sitting. I'm sitting. She spread out the shawl on her lap, obviously trying to change the subject. I finally finished it. What do you think? Charlotte picked it up and studied it. It looks beautiful. You've done a good job on it. Bess will be proud to wear it. Millie smiled. I'm going to finish up the quilt for the baby real quick. I need to make sure I get it done in time. She didn't add anything about the baby coming early, because Patience was listening. Patience was worried enough about her already. I'm going to give the floors a good scrubbing this afternoon. Is there any other cleaning you want done before Christmas? Millie looked around. Charlotte had been doing a fine job of keeping everything up with Patience's help. The stove needs to be blacked, but other than that, everything is looking good. She stood to get her sewing basket, but Charlotte stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. What are you going for? I'll get whatever it is. Millie sighed. I just need my sewing basket. Before Charlotte could take a step toward it to bring it to her friend, Patience had already set it down on the table for her mother. How can I help, Mama? You just mind Charlotte. If she needs help with anything, she'll ask. Patience went back to sit down and play with her sister while Charlotte got the wash water ready. I'll do the floors in the bedrooms today and black the stove in the morning. That way I can clean up any mess I make tomorrow. Millie nodded. Have you finished the socks and tie you were making yet? I have. All my gifts are ready to go. I've even wrapped them all in tissue paper. Good. Then all of the gifts for our guests are done. We're going to have a wonderful Christmas. Charlotte smiled. As long as I get to spend it with people I love, it's always a wonderful Christmas. She picked up the bucket of water and scrub brush, and went into Millie's room to start the scrubbing. Chapter 8. Charlotte was up early on Christmas morning, excited to give the gifts she'd so carefully made for the family. She walked into the main room to start the fire and put the turkey on before she went out to collect eggs. She carefully set the table and placed her gift for each of the family members on their plate first. She made French toast for breakfast that morning, remembering Millie's instructions exactly. By the time George came out to milk the cow, she was whipping the eggs with the milk from last night. Merry Christmas, he said in his deep voice. Merry Christmas. She continued to beat the eggs and went to cut up an old loaf of bread. Don't wake anyone until I've come back in. I have gifts to set up. She smiled and nodded. She couldn't wait to see what he and the boys had made for Millie. The boys had been dropping hints about it since she'd arrived. While Charlotte cooked breakfast, George brought in a beautiful rocking chair, a small chest for baby clothes, and a polished wooden cradle. Millie was going to love those. As soon as Charlotte finished, she went to Millie's scrap bag and pulled out a long red ribbon. By the time George came back in with a small wooden doll cradle, obviously for the girls, Charlotte had tied the pretty red ribbon to the rocking chair. George smiled. That's perfect. Thank you. He washed his hands quickly. I've milked the cow. I'm going to go fetch the milk. Wake everyone and have them dress, but don't let them leave their rooms. Oh. And see if there's anything Millie wants you to put out for her. Charlotte knocked on Millie's door. George said to get dressed, but you're not allowed to come out of your room yet. Do you have anything you'd like me to put out in the way of presents? Millie handed her 4 stockings and several small gifts with names written on them. She took them all and placed them on each of the plates. She was surprised to see one with her name on it, but shouldn't have been. Millie would never dream of leaving her out. She woke Patience and told her to dress Grace, but they needed to stay in their room until they were told they could come out. She called up to the loft for the boys to dress, but stay upstairs as well. She put the big platter with the French toast in the center of the table, and when George came back and started to pour the milk. Charlotte had never been as excited about a Christmas as she was this one. At the orphanage, Christmas was simply a day when they received hand-me-down clothes. It had never been anything special with magic in the air like this one. Finally, when the table was ready, George called for everyone to come to breakfast. Charlotte watched Millie's face as she came out and stroked her hand along the back of the beautiful rocker. It would be a good place for her to sit now while she did her sewing, and after the baby came, she would be able to rock her to sleep there. Millie's eyes filled with tears and she hugged George tightly. "It's perfect. Thank you." The children all sat down and fingered the gifts on their plates. "One at a time or all together?" Millie asked. It was then Charlotte realized it was her first Christmas with her new family. Millie seemed to have been a part of the family forever. George grinned at her enthusiasm. "Let's go one at a time, youngest to oldest. Grace, you first." Grace picked up the 2 gifts on her plate and opened the first quickly. It was a small rag doll Millie had made. Grace stared at it with open eyes and then hugged it tight. "What's her name?" Millie smiled. "You get to name her. She's your baby." They all watched the little girl carefully as she contemplated a name for her new baby. Grace tilted her head to the side while she thought about it. She didn't know a lot of names. "Toast. Her name is Toast." Everyone laughed. "Why Toast?" Millie almost bit her tongue instead of asking, but she had to know. "I like her and I like toast, so her name is Toast." She reached for the second present, the one from Charlotte. She opened it. It was an intricately sewn quilt for a baby doll. Charlotte didn't know when she made it if she had a doll, but she knew she could make her one quick enough if she didn't. Grace stroked it with excited fingers. "Toast has her own blanket. What do you say for your presents, Grace?" Millie prompted. "Thank you." Jacob went next. He opened the one from Charlotte first. It was a small wooden train she had found in a shop in Boston. Jacob hugged it to his chest. "A train, my very own train." He didn't wait to be prompted. "Oh, thank you." He tore quickly into the next present. It was a small box filled with child-sized hand-carved wooden tools. He took each tool out and studied it with a look of awe on his face. "Oh, Papa. Now I can help you build things." George nodded at his younger son. "Of course you can." He had one package left, which he opened quickly. It was 3 pair of new socks. Millie knew her present wouldn't be the hit of the other 2, but she'd made it with love, and that's what mattered. He fingered them. "Oh, good. I had a hole in my other socks, and now Mama won't get mad at me for wearing them without shoes." "Thank you." They all laughed and their attention turned to Michael. He opened the first of his packages, a tie from his mother to wear to church. He smiled and said, "Thank you, Mama." The second gift, from Charlotte, had him smiling bigger. It was a wooden-covered wagon. "Jacob, we can race. My wagon against your train." "Thank you." He opened the last gift with a smile. He knew this one would be from his papa. It was a small box full of rifle shells. He fingered them happily. "Thank you, Papa." Now it was Patience's turn. They all turned their attention to her. There were only 2 presents on her plate. She opened Charlotte's first. It was a beautiful length of lace. "I thought it would look pretty on a petticoat," Charlotte suggested. "Oh, thank you. It's wonderful." Patience ran her fingers over it. "I've never seen anything so pretty." She reached for the second package from her mother. It was a pretty green dress, the same color as the one Charlotte wore to church every Sunday. "Wow. I can't wait to wear this to church." "Thank you, Mama." She didn't ask where her gift from her papa was. She knew it was there somewhere. George stood up from the table and carried the small baby doll cradle up behind the 2 girls. "This is for you to share." Patience smiled and hugged him. "Thank you. My baby Molly will fit on one end, and Toast can sleep on the other." Grace bounced up and down. "They can share Toast's blanket." Millie smiled at her friend. "You're next, Charlotte." Charlotte looked at the small package on the plate in front of her. She carefully tore the tissue paper to see what was inside. It was an intricately carved wooden box. "Oh, it's beautiful." Millie smiled. "George made it. My contribution is inside." Millie watched her friend carefully, hoping she'd be happy with what she'd made her. Charlotte lifted off the lid and looked inside. Millie had carefully copied out all of her recipes for her. "Oh, it's just what I'll need." "Thank you." Millie fingered the package on her plate, wondering what it could be. She was already so blessed by the rocking chair and the cradle. There was nothing else she really needed. She opened it slowly, savoring the surprise. A baby quilt. "Oh, it's beautiful. Now I don't have to hurry quite so fast. A baby can never have enough blankets." "Thank you, Charlotte." She looked at the one in her hands, and the one in front of Grace. "You matched them perfectly." Charlotte nodded. "I thought Grace would enjoy having a quilt to match her little brother or sisters." They all focused on George then. He opened Charlotte's package first. It was a pair of plain dark blue suspenders. Millie had suggested them in a letter when Charlotte had asked. "Thank you, Charlotte. My old suspenders were getting frayed. I'll wear these with pride." He reached for the second gift from Millie. It was a warm scarf to wear when he had to go out into the cold wind. "Thank you, Millie. This will keep me warm." They all smiled at their gifts and each other. The children wouldn't open their stockings until after breakfast. George said a quick prayer for them and they ate heartily. After Charlotte did the dishes with patience, the children all opened their stockings. In each one was an orange, 2 hard candy sticks, and a penny. "Wow. Santa was good to us." Patience cried. She immediately broke off a small piece of the candy and popped it into her mouth. Charlotte smiled watching the excitement on the children's faces. "This is how Christmas should be," she thought. "I'm going to start baking the bread for Christmas dinner. I've got the turkey in the oven. Once the bread is rising, I'll start on a pie. Since Bess is bringing a dessert, I thought I should fix only one. What kind should it be?" Millie tilted her head to the side and thought about it. "Bess will probably bring apple, because it's John's favorite. Maybe cherry, or blackberry?" She called out to George. "Would you rather have cherry or blackberry pie for dessert?" "Blackberry for me." "Kids?" "Cherry." "Blackberry." "I like cherry." "I like both." Millie laughed. "Maybe one of each. They won't go to waste." Charlotte nodded. "I can do that." She took out her recipe cards Millie had made her and carefully selected the one for bread and the one for pie crust. "What else are you making?" Millie carefully wrapped the shawl she'd made for Bess. They were expecting their company in the early afternoon, and she wanted everything ready: carrots, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, white bread, and the turkey Michael shot is already in the oven, of course. "Am I missing anything?" That all sounds good. Maybe a second vegetable like peas or maybe green beans." She thought about what she'd canned that would be easy to cook. "Why don't you make green beans? You can just heat up 2 jars of them to make an easy vegetable." Charlotte nodded. She was going to be cooking non-stop until dinner time and then she'd be cleaning for hours. She wasn't sure now it had been such a good idea to invite them for Christmas dinner. A regular meal would have been hard enough. Patience jumped to her feet and put her apron on. "I'll help. Many hands make the work lighter." Charlotte smiled down at Patience. "Thank you. Do you want to run down and get a jar of cherries, a jar of blackberries, 2 jars of green bean and some carrots and potatoes for me?" George stood up. "We men will go and get all that for you. It's enough Patience is helping with the cooking." He and the boys put their jackets on and went out to the cellar, coming back a few minutes later with their arms laden with food. Charlotte made a double batch of bread, knowing at least a couple of loaves would be eaten during dinner. She spent all the time until their guests arrived in the kitchen working. Bess offered to help when she arrived, but Charlotte waved her away. "Go sit with Millie. You don't need to be on your feet any more than she does." She was barely able to acknowledge James as she hurriedly cooked their special meal. When it was finally done, she splashed some water on her face, sure she had flour on it. Patience quickly set the table, and put the gifts on plates for the guests. She guided everyone in where to sit while Charlotte put the food on the table. John said their Christmas blessing, carefully thanking God for the gift of his son, and thanking him for the wonderful company they were able to keep on this holy day. Charlotte was surprised to see all the plates had gifts on them when she finally sat down. Hers had 2 small gifts. She blinked quickly, wondering what they could be. Once again, they went youngest to oldest, so little Grace opened hers first. She squealed when she saw a small dress, just the right size for her rag doll. Toast will love it. Bess looked at Millie. Toast? Millie smiled. She named her new rag doll Toast, because she loves toast, and she loves her doll. The laughter once again filled the table. Grace put the small dress on her lap and looked to Jacob to see what he had received. Jacob received a small bag of marbles. When they went on church picnics, the older children frequently had marbles, and he'd always felt left out. Oh, thank you. My very own marbles. Michael fingered his package. It was a small box with a piece of paper inside. He couldn't yet read, so he handed the paper to Patience. Your present is in the barn. Michael jumped to his feet. May I go look, Mama? Please? Millie nodded and George and John went out with him. Michael came back into the house with his arms full of a squirming puppy. Bess whispered, George said it was okay. I hope you don't mind. Millie shook her head, thrilled with the ecstatic look on Michael's face. What are you going to name him? Just then the puppy jumped out of his arms and wet on the floor. Michael's eyes widened as he looked at Millie to see if she'd be upset. I think I'm going to name him Puddles. Millie laughed. As long as you clean that Puddle up and take him back out to the barn. He scooped up his puppy and carried him back outside while Jacob got down and cleaned up the mess for him. Maybe he'll share Puddles with me if I help clean up his messes. Patience, true to her name, sat staring at her gift, but waited until both of her brothers had washed their hands and returned to the table before she opened it. It was a pair of thick woolen mittens and a scarf to match. Oh, thank you. Bess smiled. I thought with all the sleigh rides you were going on lately, you might need something to keep you warm. They all looked to Charlotte next. She was the only one with 2 packages on her plate. She opened the first carefully. It was a beautiful white linen tablecloth that had been embroidered around the edge with small roses. She ran her fingers over the perfect needlework. It's beautiful. Thank you. She folded the cloth nicely and set it beside her plate. She picked up the other package, which she was sure was from James. She opened it to find a small wooden box he'd obviously carved himself. Inside was a brooch for fastening a shawl. It had a butterfly on the end of it. This is wonderful. Thank you. She was embarrassed he'd given her something so nice, when she'd just made him socks. He smiled and reached over to squeeze her hand in his. She knew everyone watching was expecting an engagement announcement any day. Millie went next, opening the package quickly. It was 3 more beautiful baby gowns. Thank you. I wasn't sure 5 would be enough. Bess smiled. Just remember when your baby outgrows them, her friend will need them in a few months. Millie laughed. Don't worry. I won't forget. Bess came next and opened the beautiful shawl Millie had made for her. She fingered the perfect stitches in her hands. This is beautiful. Thank you. It'll be perfect for the spring. James went next, opening his socks. Wonderful. I thought I was going to have to beg Bess to start working on a new pair for me. He smiled at Charlotte, certain she'd been the one to make them. They're perfect. John opened his gift next. He grinned at the tie. My old one was getting frayed, but my wife has been too busy sewing for the baby to worry about how I look. They all laughed. Thank you. It's just what I needed. George went next, opening his gift and slowly examining it. What is it? He finally asked. It was a small seed of some sort, but what kind he didn't know. At the church picnic over the summer, you ate some watermelon and said how you wished you had some seeds to grow your own. John pointed to the seeds in his hand. Grow your own. George's face split into a grin. Now, that's a good gift. Thank you. Millie grinned at the happy look on her husband's face. She'd planned on finding some watermelon seeds for her kitchen garden to surprise him this summer. Now it wouldn't be a surprise, but he'd get to look forward to watermelon for months. We'd better eat before this feast gets cold. Charlotte's been working on it all day. Charlotte watched with awe as the men each ate 3 huge platefuls of the food. They talked and laughed while they ate, but no one slowed down. Finally, when no one could eat another bite, she got to her feet and began clearing the table. Patience had worked hard to keep up with the dishes all day, so there weren't nearly as many to deal with as Charlotte had worried there would be. Still, it took them a good hour to store all the leftovers and get all of the dishes done. After dumping the dishwater out away from the house, she returned and dried her hands on her apron. Who's hungry for dessert? I made cherry pie and blackberry pie. I brought an apple pie, Bess added. Patience and Charlotte put the pies on the table and Millie served everyone a slice of their preferred pie. The men each had 2 slices. They're going to have to roll me into church tomorrow morning, John groaned. Thank you for including us in your Christmas dinner. This is the best Christmas I can remember. We're happy you were here to share it with us, George told them honestly. After they'd gone, George read the story of Jesus' birth from the Bible and they all gathered around to listen. Once he was done, it was time for baths and for everyone to go to sleep. They had church tomorrow. Chapter 9. The following week went by quickly. Charlotte was counting off the days, knowing if Millie could just keep carrying the baby for another week, she'd have a chance. Millie seemed more tired every day, and had started taking long naps in the afternoons. Now that Charlotte had a little more experience with cooking, and had her own recipes, she was able to carry on without her. Late on Friday night, the night of December 31st, just after they'd put the children to bed, Millie's water broke. Charlotte's eyes widened at the timing. It was as if God had heard their prayers to keep Millie pregnant at least until the 1st. George left on horseback to fetch Ellie, while Charlotte began boiling water, knowing it would be needed for sterilization. It was around 5 on New Year's morning that the baby came into the world. It was a sweet-faced little girl, looking way too tiny to survive, who Charlotte carried into the kitchen to give her first bath. Her eyes were wide as she stared down at this precious gift from God, thinking how miraculous it was she'd survived. Once she was bathed, she knocked on the door where the midwife still was with Millie. May I bring her in to meet her mama? Ellie came to the door and cracked it just a bit. We're not quite ready here. Is George still in the barn? Charlotte nodded, her eyes wide with concern. Is Millie okay? Ellie smiled. She's doing well. She's just trying to deliver this little one's brother or sister. Twins? Were you expecting twins? Ellie shook her head. No, but that doesn't mean anything. I've delivered them before. Go rock that little girl. If George comes in, send him right back out to the barn. We're not ready for him yet. Charlotte sat down holding the baby. Your name is Faith, she whispered. Your mama said she never knew what true faith was until she married your papa, so your name had to be Faith. She kept up the endless chatter to try to keep her nerves from becoming frayed. Finally, Ellie came to the door of the bedroom holding the second baby. It's a boy. Charlotte felt the tears spring to her eyes. Millie had one of each now. She put baby Faith into the cradle and went to get the little boy. They'd been so certain of having a girl, she wasn't even sure they'd picked out a boy's name. Charlotte took him and carefully bathed him, just as she had his sister. They were both so small they'd fit into the little cradle together. George would need to get started on another soon, though. Once the baby was clean, she knocked on the door. Is everything okay? Ellie called, come on in. Everything's fine. She carried the little boy into the room and placed him in Millie's arms. Millie was sitting up in bed, looking exhausted but happy. What were you thinking having two? No wonder you were so run down. Millie grinned. I'm not complaining. I have enough love for 2 more. She smiled, staring at the baby in her arms. I have enough love for another 20. Charlotte smiled. I wouldn't say that around your husband. I don't think he's ready for you to be pregnant again anytime soon. She stood. Let me bring you your little girl, and then I'll go get George. He's got to be going crazy with worry by now. She slipped on her coat and walked out to the barn. Millie's ready to see you. George turned his eyes wide with fear. She's okay? His voice was as close to panic as she'd ever heard from the calm, even-tempered man. Charlotte nodded. She's fine. Go see her. Is it a boy or girl? I think you need to ask your wife that. Millie needed to be the one to share the surprise. She knew George would be thrilled to have 2. He loved his children so much, she couldn't imagine him ever being unhappy about having more. Charlotte and Ellie both stepped out of the room to give them time alone with their babies. George's eyes popped when he saw Millie propped up in bed with a baby in each arm. He shook his head. I should have known you'd do everything your own way. 2? His face split into a huge grin. She grinned. 1 of each. I couldn't leave us uneven. He sat down on the bed beside her. Which is which? She indicated the baby in her left arm. That's the boy. We don't have a boy name yet, you know. This one is Faith. He took the little girl from her arm and held her. She's so tiny. Are they strong enough to make it? He was almost afraid to hold such a tiny baby. His other children had all been on the large side. Ellie thinks so. She said twins almost always come early. They're small, so we'll have to be extra careful about illness, but they should be just fine. The happiness in her voice was a huge relief to George. George took a deep breath for the first time in what felt like months. I'm just glad you're okay. Millie nodded. I'm sure having 2 in there was just too much. They tired me out more than they would have if it had just been 1. She stared down at the baby in her arms. What should we name him? What do you think of the name Daniel? I know we hadn't talked about boys' names yet, but that's what's been in my head. Millie smiled. I like that. We can call him Danny now, and when he's older, he'll be Daniel. Or Dan. George leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss to Millie's cheek. Thank you for my children. When George opened the door to come out, he still had a dazed look on his face. He smiled at Charlotte. She's hungry. I don't think she's told me she's hungry in months. Charlotte grinned. She and Ellie had talked for a while, before Ellie left. Ellie had told her the importance of Millie eating and drinking as much as she could during the next couple of weeks. She was way too thin, and trying to nurse 2 babies was going to take a lot out of her. Charlotte promised to do her best. As she cooked breakfast, she thought about how hard it was to live in a place as rural as this. If something had gone wrong during the birth, there was no doctor to call. Millie could have died. If she'd seen a doctor earlier in her pregnancy, they may have been able to tell her she was carrying twins, and let her know what to do differently. There were too many ifs in her thinking, though. It may have all worked out just the same if a doctor had been involved. Charlotte couldn't help but think of the years ahead of her if she married James. She would work her fingers to the bone every single day. When she gave birth, there would be no doctor and she may or may not survive. Most women gave birth with no doctor, of course, but back in Boston, one could be summoned. Here, there was no way that could happen. Did she really want to spend the rest of her life in hardship? She shook her head. She didn't. Of course, there was nowhere to go. What would she do if she didn't stay here and marry James? She set the table and called the family in for the meal, surprised when Millie joined them at the table. She'd been planning on taking her a plate. I can bring your food to you. Millie shook her head. I'll eat here with my family. She'd already dressed and put the 2 infants into the cradle together. George looked at the babies. I guess the boys and I are going to be making a cradle today. He didn't seem disappointed to have to push back anything else he was planning to do. Millie laughed. They can share that one for a week or so, until they're too big. George shook his head. No, we'll get started on it right away. I'm so glad Bess gave me those extra gowns. I'll need to make some more anyway, but at least we'll have enough for the first few days. I'll get started on the first one as soon as we can buy some more cotton. Charlotte smiled, trying to be happy about the extra work that twins would bring. Could she really spend the rest of her life working like this? Chapter 10. The entire family missed church the following day, because the babies weren't old enough to be taken out. Afterward, John and Bess came by to check on them, assuming the baby had come. So, she had the baby right? Bess asked from the doorway. Charlotte opened the door wide. Come on in. Yes, the baby is here. She knew Millie wanted to tell Bess about the twins herself, so she didn't say anything. Bess walked in and Millie was sitting quietly in her rocker, with a baby in each arm. Bess cried out and ran to her. Twins? Boys or girls? Millie grinned at her friend's excitement. One of each. The look of pride on her face said a lot. May I hold one of them? Of course. Bess stooped down and took one of the babies from her arms. That's our little boy. His name is Daniel. Bess stared down at the tiny face. He's so little. Is there any danger? Ellie suggested we keep them home until my actual due date, which is still another month away. They're just too small and fragile. If they catch something, it could easily kill them. Millie snuggled Faith closer to her. So we'll be missing church for a few weeks. At least the babies and I will. The others may start back before we do. It will all depend on how quickly I'm up to taking care of both babies. I'm so glad you have Charlotte here to help. Bess looked over her shoulder at Charlotte. She's been a real blessing. She has. I feel badly that she's doing so much for me, but I really need her. Hopefully I can help her out when her first baby comes along. Bess smiled. I hope that's soon. James still wants to come by for a sleigh ride this afternoon. I told him to pick me up on the way, and I'll stay here while they're gone. Millie smiled. That's a wonderful idea. I didn't want Charlotte to miss out, but I need someone here to help with the babies. I'm not quite sure of myself with them yet. Bess shook her head. You shouldn't be. You expected to have one baby, and instead you had two. She looked at her friend with a critical eye. Please tell me Charlotte is poking food down your throat whether you want it or not. Suddenly, food is all I can think about. I'm just ravenous. Charlotte's bringing me snacks every couple of hours, and making sure I always have water or milk to drink. She was happy to be able to alleviate everyone's fears. Good for Charlotte. Charlotte walked over. I heard you say you're coming back while I go on the sleigh ride. I've made plenty of food. Why don't you and John stay for lunch, and then John can go home and tell James I'm here? Bess nodded. That would be nice if it's okay with you, Millie. You know I always love to have you over. Charlotte smiled. I'm putting it on the table now. Millie, would you like to come to the table, or do you want me to bring yours to you there? Millie stood and put Faith into her cradle. I'll come to the table. She took Daniel from Bess and put him into the identical cradle next to his sister. She looked down at the sleeping babies. I wish I could sketch. I want to remember them like this forever. I can understand that. They look so precious. Bess walked to the table and sat down with Millie. When were they born? Around 5 yesterday morning. Oh. I didn't know they were so new. We'd have found a way to get word to you otherwise. She looked up as John and George came into the house, stomping the snow from their feet. Sit down and have lunch with us, John. John saw his wife was already seated and joined them at the table. Charlotte had made beans and cornbread, which wasn't a meal Millie would normally want to serve guests, but with no notice, it would do. After lunch, John headed home while Charlotte and Patience saw to the dishes. I'm just going to make some eggs for dinner tonight if that's all right, Millie. Of course. I think that's fine. Millie knew Charlotte was almost as tired as she was at this point. She'd missed an entire night's sleep as well. James was there within a few minutes to take her and Patience for their ride. Is there anything I can do for you before I go? Charlotte shrugged into her coat and wound her scarf around her neck. No, thank you. I have Bess with me. You have a good time. Patience climbed into her side of the sleigh while Charlotte sat in the middle as usual. She didn't talk much as she tried to formulate what she wanted to say to James after she sent Patience into the house later. Once Patience was inside, Charlotte stayed seated in the sleigh. I've wanted to talk to you privately. James turned to her. I think we're as private as we're going to be allowed to get. What do you have in mind? She stared down at her gloved hands, unable to meet his eyes. I'm not sure I can stay out here. She said the words straight out. She thought it would be better that way, like swallowing a large dose of castor oil. After watching what Millie went through when she had the babies, I know I couldn't go through that. I would need to have a doctor close by. She paused for a moment. It's not that I don't care for you, I do. I just don't think this is the place God wants me to be. James sighed. Are you sure you're not overreacting? I know it's a hard life here, but it's also a good life. The people here have a genuine love for one another. It's not like living in a big city. Sure, there are conveniences we don't have here, but I think what we do have more than makes up for them. I just don't know. I wanted to tell you not to get your hopes up about me staying. She wasn't telling him she wouldn't marry him, but she was sure the words would come soon. I'll tell you now, my hopes are already up. I love you, Charlotte. I have a ring waiting at home, and I was planning to ask you to marry me next week on our sleigh ride. Charlotte met his eyes then for the first time. I'll pray about it. Ask me next week, and I'll give you my answer. He squeezed her hand through their gloves. I won't be angry with you if you decide not to marry me, but I won't be happy either. I do want to marry you. She nodded and he helped her down from the sleigh. She had a lot of praying to do before next Sunday. It was Friday before Millie realized how quiet her friend had been all week. With the addition of the twins to the household, things were busier than ever. By Friday, Millie was feeling well enough to take over part of the cooking and cleaning, but she still needed the help because of the sheer number of hours it took to nurse the twins. After the lunch dishes were done, Millie sent Patience to do her schoolwork in her bedroom. You need to tell me what's wrong. Charlotte sighed. I told James the first, don't think I can marry him. Millie looked at her friend with disbelief. Why would you do that? I thought you were coming to care for him. I do care for him. I love him. I just don't think I could do the kind of work you do every day for the rest of my life. And I don't think I could stand not having a doctor on call as I went through labor. You must have been frightened to death. Millie shook her head. Everyone around me was frightened, and I knew they were, but I had a feeling of peace about the whole thing. I knew God's will would win out whether there was a doctor there or not. If he wanted me to survive with healthy babies, then I would survive with healthy babies. If it wasn't his will, then it wouldn't have mattered if I had all the doctors in the world at my side. Charlotte sat and thought about her friend's words for a minute. But you work so hard. Don't you ever get tired of constantly having to work? Millie laughed. I enjoy working. I always have. If I wanted to, I could make time to sit and do things for myself. I have certain things I have to do, but I could pass some off on Patience. A farmer's wife doesn't have to work every waking hour. I enjoy my time in the evenings with my husband after the children are in bed. I visit with a friend for hours every Tuesday. My life isn't as tough as you make it seem. She paused for a minute, looking down at the baby in her arms. Honestly? I can't imagine a better life. I have a husband whom I love and who loves me. I have 6 wonderful children. How could my life be better? I used to imagine what it would be like to have a maid to do everything for me, but I could never imagine what I would do to fill my time. I find joy in the work I do. Charlotte thought about that for a minute before replying. Now that I think about it, you never spent much time just sitting and playing when we were girls either. You were always either helping with the smaller children or helping cook or doing something. I do what I do because I love it. Not because I have to. Some of the things I have to do, sure, but I could make meals much easier on myself by making the same thing all the time. I wouldn't have to put the work into them I do. I need to give James an answer on Sunday. He's going to bring a ring and ask me to marry him. Millie squeezed her friend's hand. I can't tell you what to do. I can only tell you not to run away from someone you love because you're afraid of hard work or not having a doctor if something goes wrong. Trust in God. Pray to Him, and you'll know what the right thing is for you. By the time James called for her on Sunday afternoon, Charlotte knew exactly what she'd say. He waited until Patience ran back into the house at the end of their sleigh ride, and turned to her, holding out the ring. Have you made your decision? Will you marry me? She looked down at the beautiful ring in his hand, and then up into his eyes. She smiled and nodded. I can't think of anything that would make me happier than being your wife. I'll let my worries take care of themselves. God will help me through it. He smiled and hugged her tightly. I was hoping you'd say that. When? She laughed. Are you in a hurry? He nodded emphatically. I want you for my wife as soon as possible. Well, Millie is going to need me for another few weeks at least. She needs to get into a routine with the new babies and be able to start doing everything for her family again. Why don't we say the 1st of March then? Would that give her enough time? Charlotte thought about the sewing she'd need to do before she could marry, and how quickly Millie was progressing. March sounds perfect. Why don't we say the first Saturday in March? He hugged her again. I can't wait. She smiled into his eyes, realizing she couldn't wait either. March couldn't come soon enough.